And a very good morning to you. We're live from London and you're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today, my guests, Alex von Tunzelmann and David Bodanis, share their views on the week's biggest stories. Good morning to you both. Alex, what have you spotted?
Well, I'm looking forward to talking about various stories, including the kind of ethics and the future of ancestry DNA testing after we're learning some news about Christopher Columbus, which might influence all of us, and about why South Koreans are not having children and having dogs instead.
And indeed why people are going on year-long cruises. Thank you for that. Also, after that, we'll be heading to Nairobi for the latest headlines.
This is Monocle's correspondent in Nairobi, and I will be looking at which African countries are hoping to host Formula One and why Cameroon has banned all talk about the president's health.
We'll be hearing from Naveena Kottoor in a little while. Plus, we'll be heading to Bodrum in Turkey, where Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, will be joining us after the Quality of Life conference. It's the 13th of October 2024, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you, and the warmest of welcomes to Alex von Tunzelmann and David Bodanis. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, there's a marvellous moment just before we came into the studio when David Bodanis realises that he has all of Alex von Tunzelmann's books and didn't realise that he was sitting opposite the very woman this morning.
I was so honoured. I mean, I hope I was polite to this, perfectly nice person. We're sitting around before the show and talking about this and that. And then, oh my God, you're Alex? The Alex? I worship these. Honestly, I've taken the first paragraph of one of the books and repeated it to many, many people at great length.
You're going to repeat it now, briefly? And Alex can test you for accuracy.
Oh, God. Can I just say that the beginning of the India one really was a masterpiece, and I think it should be taught in writing classes.
Oh, thank you so much.
Because it's a profound twist, and it's accurate and insightful.
Okay. Alex, do you have any of David's books?
I don't. Well, I'm going to buy them all now.
Excellent. Wonderful. Good to hear. How have your weeks been?
Gosh, quite busy, yes. I mean, the news seems a bit relentless this week. I mean, we're really building up, obviously, towards the US election, now moving into the last month towards that. So, yes, it feels like that's been kind of falling over itself.
Okay. David, how about you?
I feel personally responsible. I was so smug when Obama was president. I walked around in Britain telling everybody, yeah, our guy is so cool. And because of that, God decided to punish me and therefore mankind. Trump has the majority of support from, I think, white women in America. And it's, I think, the majority support from university graduates. It is astonishing. Something has happened, which clearly I was clueless about. Either a minor thing that was magnified by social media or a big thing that I missed.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that because first, it would be great to change direction. Head now to Bodrum, where Monocle's editorial director Tyler Brûlé is there for us following the Quality of Life conference, which took place a couple of days ago in Istanbul. A very good morning to you, Tyler. How is the afterglow?
Well, the afterglow is absolutely delightful. Good morning. You can hear this. I've got conference voice. It is. I'm fighting a bit of a cold, but I think it's on the way out. I can just say that. Well, we're of course at the extreme end of the Med. It is absolutely gorgeous. It is 27 degrees. There's not it's one or two clouds in the sky, and I'm just sort of looking at sort of all of the sprawled out on nice loungers. There's delegates here as well, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And there's a very nice boat waiting for us to, I don't know where we're going, but there's some islands called.
It sounds like it. So you're obviously having this sort of extra little bolt on, aren't you? Which is the having done the Quality of Life conference, which, let's face it, and as we can probably tell by the state of your voice, is a pretty full-on affair. It's quite nice to organise a gentle lie down afterwards.
Well, it is, and what we've noticed over the last few years, Emma, is that our delegates, many had been sort of self-organizing. I think they called themselves the Sunday Club or something, or the Saturday Club. So people fly in from all around the world. So we had 100 plus people who were, of course, from the UAE. They were from the Philippines. They came from the US, Canada, everywhere. And of course, you make this journey for a 48-hour event, and you might want the party or just the socializing to continue. So over the past years, people have done their own thing, and so we decided to formalize it this year. And so if you wanted to extend, so everything, of course, wrapped up yesterday morning. There was gallery tours, atelier tours, market tours around Istanbul. And if you wanted to, then you could jump on a plane with some other editors and head down to the Machikisi, which is where we are in Bodrum. And it's just a completely different world because there are some very, very large yachts, just beyond the islands. And there's this rhythm of life, and it of course feels very end of season, but the weather makes it feel like this still could be June.
How amazing. So, recap for us the Quality of Life conference. How was Istanbul? How did it treat you this year?
In 1 minute or less, it was fantastic. The setting, just the opening evening above the Peninsula Hotel, hosted by the mayor of the municipality of Istanbul, and it was just, of course, we kicked off on Friday morning. It was a full-on day, probably about 25 plus speakers, and looking at all aspects of course, quality of life and what that means for urbanism. But it touched, a number of different things. So we were looking at the rebuilding of Antakya off the back of the earthquakes, and then what of course will unfold there. How much do you preserve? I think that intersection of people whose homes weren't damaged, but how do they fit into, of course, a completely new urban plan? So talking about that, we had the mayor of Tirana, his sort of mission to create a completely child-friendly, almost children-first type of city. A wonderful woman, Taylor Shepard, who is formerly in command of the U.S. One of the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarines. And people thought, well, what does that have to do with quality of life? But what was remarkable is she was talking about so many of the forces that impact us every day, and a lot of it was also about conflict resolution, because when you've got scores of people in a very long steel tube, hundreds of meters below the sea surface, you have to be able to diffuse things effectively quite quickly, because you're just reminded that these people are at sea for up to 4 months at a time, and they're never coming up. I mean, it's remarkable. And one of the fascinating things that people found is how do you sort of get back to center, and this notion that you're not in communication with the rest of the world either. You sort of think, maybe with all amazing modern communications, that yes, you're emailing back and forth with your family, but of course, these are secret missions. You cannot reveal where you are. So what was remarkable was also the story of technology, but actually what keeps people sane are the books that they bring beneath, and the magazines as well, that they bring beneath the surface with them.
And it's one of the reasons why she was on the panel in the conference was because she, in fact, reaches out to Monocle, because it's something that gives her a bit of a boost when she's hundreds of meters underwater.
Well, yes, that was why Ms. Shepard got the invite, because we just received, it was one of those really sort of tear-jerking letters that you receive from a reader, and it was remarkable, because she just talked about, she loves Conflict magazine because it was about escapism, and it was beauty, and she explained to Sophie and all of us why she thought what Conflict does is so important, and also said, Monocle as well, she would just look forward to long reads, and it would sort of just again broaden her mind, not just politically, but also just thinking about the entrepreneurs that we cover, as much as what might be sort of the cultural or design diversions as well. But it was amazing this sort of fixation on beauty and escapism on the printed page, and yet of course you're thinking about this vessel, which of course is armed to the teeth and probably one of the most deadly platforms in the world.
Finally, Tyler, before we let you go and get on your boat to goodness knows where on your daily adventure, there are the lovely trappings of the event outside the conference room, when you have a little bit of entertainment and maybe a bit of shoe leather is worn out on the dance floor. How is the social life this year?
The social life was very good, but I have to say the schedule was so packed. And I think there's part of it is also the diversion of just the beauty of being on the Bosphorus. So we had an amazing reception, maybe halfway between, let's say, those of our listeners who know Istanbul on the European side, but I'd say halfway between sort of the Golden Horn towards Bebek, in this formerly abandoned palace was the setting. But it was so gorgeous just to be outside after dinner, have a drink, and just watch, of course, the ebb and flow of everything happening. That actually the dance floor was not that busy. I think there was a maybe panic moment at about 1 a.m. when I think they were wrapping up at 3 o'clock, that people realized, we better hustle ourselves back inside and at least sort of get on the tiles, which did happen. But Emma was not as extended as usually, just because the setting was just so alluring.
Tyler, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on all the events at the Monocle Quality of Life Conference in Istanbul. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. A very good morning to you once again, David and Alex. That idea that I loved what Tyler was talking about there, about being a military commander, a submariner, hundreds of metres underneath the sea, and finding beauty in escapism. It made quite a good lesson for us all, isn't it? Because we don't necessarily find much beauty in escapism, even above ground. David?
When you're unhappy, everything is irritating. If you've ever seen a rich person at a fancy restaurant with a look of disdain and distaste, or if one saves up a real lot and you're going to a fancy place yourself, you expect perfection, and everything that isn't perfect, you get angry at. Think on the contrast of the times when you're happy. When the kids are in a good mood, or there's a pet, or there's even good news politically, or your good buddy is back in town who you didn't expect. You barely notice the fact that, I don't know, maybe a fabric is uncomfortable on your skin, or there's some a delay on the bus that becomes invisible because we have an override in our head. It's easy to dwell on external pain when we have larger internal pain. In the submarine, or same within the space program, they look really hard for people who can transcend the situation. Because if you look at the situation, it's actually kind of a microcosm for our finite life on Earth. They're trapped in a submarine. We're trapped in these small bodies. Read any Irish author in the last several centuries. We're just waiting, surrounded by oblivion before and after us. David Hume on his deathbed, a great calm Scottish philosopher, said, "Aren't you worried about dying?" He said, I didn't exist for millions of years before I was born. It won't bother me afterwards.
He also said something along the lines of, he died at 65, didn't he? And he said something along the lines of, why am I worried about dying early? Because I've only got another 20 years of infirmities to worry about. And I thought, what a wonderful way of looking at it. At least I don't get creaky. It's incredible that idea.
It's a very cheery morning.
A wonderful cheery morning. We've gone from the gorgeous vistas at Bodrum to what happens when you die. And but finding that little element of joy when you are in whatever kind of physical or metaphorical submarine is sometimes a bit of a challenge. But obviously this has been found and talked about this weekend.
Shows that you can. I mean, I think actually it is very uplifting to think about that, to think about finding those moments of joy. I mean, we all had to do it, of course, being locked up for such a long time during the pandemic. And it was interesting to see how people did respond to that by discovering new hobbies and, kind of baking sourdough and becoming quite creative about what they did. Although, I mean, that's the positive side. I'm sure lots of people also did things like drink too much and various other issues around
These are all things you can't do on a submarine. I don't know how much sourdough you can bake. I'm not quite sure how much drinking you can do. And you have some quite large furry cats as well.
They would not like a submarine.
I don't think the submarine would like the cats much either.
No.
Not entirely sure what the air filtration system would do.
Yes.
We've had a conversation about Alex and her cats before. Anybody who remembers, she has a trolley, ladies and gentlemen. Too big to take to the vet, is that right?
Too big to go to the vet, have to go into a trolley.
Let's look at today's news. What's caught your eye, David?
I was struck by these hurricanes in Florida. I have some family in Florida. We were going to have a family reunion, which has now been moved to Texas, another state where people say the weather has mysteriously changed for reasons we can't discern. It has nothing to do with the large industries we support. Florida especially bothers me because at least in Texas, you could say, well, some of the Republican politicians have certain links with the oil and gas industry, so it's maybe to their financial advantage. Florida doesn't have that much of an oil and gas industry. I know there's some. There is a certain agriculture, so it's more like a cultural reason, a type of political affiliation to insist angrily that there is no climate change.
So the point of this is that the hurricane has happened. Many people are saying, well, that is just a clear, evidential link to climate change.
Yeah.
And yet in Florida, they're sticking their fingers in their ears and shouting la la la.
Exactly. Luckily, not everybody in Florida, my relatives in particular, are not doing that. But the governor and many of the people in the establishment. And the science is pretty clear. Warm water evaporates more easily, and you get more hurricanes with more warm water. It's no surprise warm air holds it more.
And it's one of those moments when Donald Trump really played politics with this. There were accusations that he out and out lied at a rally, accusing Kamala Harris of diverting money that was intended for flood and hurricane victims to other projects which suited her better. And there was the lie peddled about people would only get $750 in terms of compensation and what have you. The accusations flew, and one wondered at whether we'd actually crossed a line here, because to tell a lie or to be to be politically duplicitous is one thing, but to actually actively, affirmatively mislead people is a completely different business, isn't it, Alex?
I think the rhetoric has really ramped up in the last week, and this is probably because we're now less than a month out from the election. What it feels like to me, and we can see in the polls that really it seems to be pretty much neck and neck. I mean, this could go either way, but clearly Trump is not actually very confident about winning, because that's why he's digging in to these more and more extreme pronouncements. Yes, I mean, part of that, of course, was him also saying that immigrants would get more money than people who'd, had hurricane damage and all of this. I mean, it's complete falsehoods. And he really has ramped up the rhetoric on migrants in the last few days as well, to a point where, some people who really aren't hysterical people have been saying this is very reminiscent of 1930s German language. This is really quite uncomfortable.
Oh, totally. If I can add to that, there was an analysis of Twitter last week when with the storms in North Carolina, and Twitter encouraged. There were over 138 million hits for these anti-Semitic attacks on. That not Mrs. Green, that it was a government-controlled process, but on the head of FEMA, the Emergency Relief Organization in America, happens to be a Cuban Jew. And the mayor of one of the small towns in North Carolina was Jewish. And Musk was allowing, even against the handful of censors that are supposed to check reality on Twitter, was allowing these accounts to be to assert that they specifically were blocking relief and encouraging problems. It's sad for a couple of reasons. It shows the problems of centralized social media. It really isn't as dispersed. Musk can decide one way or another. It also sadly shows that these and in particular this old conspiracy, resonates. People are pushing that, and it responds for a reason. And sadly, a certain number of Trump supporters will think, there's got to be something to that.
There's a vulnerability, though, to the victims that has to be factored into this rhetoric nowadays. And in terms of, I'm just reading a report now in The Independent about a man who's saying that his father-in-law has refused to accept help from FEMA, the agency which does offer support in situations like this, because he was afraid, having listened to what Donald Trump said, is that FEMA would take his house if he accepted assistance from the agency. I mean, regardless of your politics, to have that kind of line sent, go out there and resonate with people who are in a desperate situation is incredibly damaging, isn't it?
It's extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, what is being played with here is some really dangerous stuff, very dangerous material. And of course, you've got that side of it. You've also got the side that David mentioned of whipping up these, very anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and so on, which, absolutely can rebound. We've already seen this happen with the completely baseless attacks made by J.D. Vance and so on Haitians in Springfield. That has resulted in racist attacks, in an increase in Ku Klux Klan activity around Springfield, and it has real-world consequences very, very quickly, this stuff. And meanwhile, you've got the sort of complete insanity, as David says, of people not believing it's climate change and instead believing that the Democrats or Jews or whoever else they're trying to blame have invented hurricane machines that can be fired to change the weather. And it's like,
which would be funny.
Yeah, I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't really serious in terms of the implications. And of course, we have invented hurricane-generating machines, which are indeed fossil fuel plants. I mean, That is what it is.
David, at the beginning of this programme, you were talking about how you seem to have been sideswiped by the way that the election is going in terms of who's supporting whom and why?
Sure. In 2016, there were all these articles where British newspapers and American newspapers would send East Coast liberals to small towns. I grew up partly in Chicago, but partly in a small town right near Springfield, Ohio. So I know that area really well. They'd go to diners and they would find uneducated people and say, oh, isn't it sad that these uneducated people are supporting Trump? They fall for this pretense of being a populist while in fact they're supporting the oligarchy, a kind of standard political theory thing. But looking at, and I thought, oh, okay, that's vaguely understandable. It's sad, but understandable. But to find that a huge number of educated people or people who aren't suffering financially are doing this, that kind of hurts. I've been talking about it with a very bright 16-year-old stepson, who I know well, and indeed is my stepson. And we're trying to think, what is the positive thing from this? And I think a lot of people, they like sheer power. You know, sometimes if you're ever in a law case, law court, you'll say, oh, my lawyer is a Rottweiler. And you identify with the power of that. We like sport teams that work. We say, wow, that person's so powered. Little boys dress up in Transformer items. I believe some female human beings have been able to purchase clothes which suggest certain other powers. So we wrap up in these forces. And Trump, unfortunately, is a force which many people like. They wouldn't mind being able to do that. Do whatever you want at any time. And also be able to have people who are higher than you crushed. What a nice feeling. What
kind of power is Donald Trump? Because inherently he's clearly powerful because he's a property magnate and he is pretty much, even without having to be president of the United States, he has inherent power. But in terms of the power that he wields over the people, the difficulty is and this is where the problem starts, is power does not necessarily mean knowledge.
Oh, totally.
Or wisdom.
Absolutely. It's more on a primal level. That's why what Alex was saying about these things being dangerous is true, because we know historically that these various lines inciting violence, inciting racial hatred, it touches something deep in us. Think of all the times in your daily life when you have to be a grown-up. Take a deep breath. Oh, God.
Constantly.
Yeah, exactly. Don't get angry at somebody. Understand their perspective. Be willing to wait. Now imagine if somebody said, you don't have to do that. It's Mephistopheles. It's like, it's this offer. Imagine you didn't have to do that. Imagine, that's why we often have an othering. When the British Empire was big, people say, oh, but the natives over there could do whatever they wanted. The natives over there could, and in fact, it wasn't true. Societies around the world have very complex, tight controls, but it was a fantasy projection of what somebody wanted.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's an incredibly human thing. Absolutely is rooted in imperialism and so on, but it's visible everywhere. It's visible in all human societies. And I agree with that. I think there's a certain license going on with this. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, it was observed a few years ago that with Trump, people were saying, well, how could people support him? Because, he says these horrible things and it's cruel and nasty. And then somebody came up with this observation that the cruelty is the point.
Yes.
That this is actually licensing something quite dark within us that wants to see people kicked, wants to see people punished, wants to see harshness and cruelty in society.
I don't know if you're familiar, there are studies with how young girls get rid of their Barbie dolls. And they play with the Barbie dolls for a while, and then when they get done with the Barbie dolls...
Hack them to bits.
Yes, they often get really angry. And so sometimes people say, well, how could women, again, the great majority of white women in America support Trump. How can they support somebody who said these terrible things against women? And the thing is, a lot of women, they don't like Barbie. Barbie's perfect. Barbie's really weirdly shaped. And Barbie's like the sort of person who maybe tormented me. I wish to be able to get back at Barbie. Trump would attack people at beauty pageants. Sadly, some people will identify with the anger against the people he attacked.
Where does Kamala Harris live with this one? Because this was all crystallized about 10, 15 years ago with Michelle Obama saying, when they go low, we go high. And that suddenly seems to have become, if what you were saying is bearing out, is actually harder than it looks.
Well, I don't think it's worked. I mean, if it had worked, we wouldn't be in this position now, quite honestly. Although I do think probably what Michelle Obama went was more situation-specific and nuanced than often we now assume from that quote. But I think now you're looking at a situation where actually, I think Kamala Harris is running an excellent campaign. I just don't know whether the United States is ready to accept that campaign is perhaps the point. But it's been very interesting to notice that in the last week she has said stuff like, she's appeared with Liz Cheney. She has come out with this statement that she would like a bipartisan advisors to her when she's in office. And I don't think these are a softening towards the complete insanity, really, of the Trump-led Republican Party. I think this is very deliberate signalling to moderate Republicans and to people, who could be peeled off, who are themselves often quite horrified by what is happening with the Trump leadership.
Indeed, she appeared on a talk show aimed at women, daytime women's show, earlier on this week. And this is when she pulled Donald Trump up, isn't it? When we were talking about the hurricane, she said, this is beyond politics. This is not about politics and lying. But this, she was mentioning that this is dangerous. And, you knew exactly why she was on that panel, that point, because as you've just mentioned there, David, her support among women is diminishing. But there's an article in the New York Times this morning that says that black voters are now drifting from Democrats, imperiling Harris's bid. It says she is on track to win a majority of black votes and has brought many back to her party since she took over from Biden. But she says that still a significant gap in support persists. That suggests that the lines that we would traditionally monitor, relevance, appeal, what have you, are blurring, because she's not as attractive to women as she could be. She's not attractive to black voters. So where does she look now?
I would caution a couple of things about that polling. Yeah. I would say, first of all, they're looking at a very long-term trend there, not a recent one, where black voters have been becoming more middle class, and therefore, and there's a pretty consistent link that makes you sort of more right-wing as you develop personal wealth. I mean, that's actually a very, very long-term trend. And I don't think it maps necessarily onto, as that says, actually Kamala Harris has won back quite a few black voters recently. So I think, you could look at a very long term or you can look at a shorter term. If they're looking at since Reagan, that's a very long period. At the same time, I would also say I think polling at the moment there are kind of some serious questions about how polling is being conducted. And that's partly because, on a really basic level, it's done by phones still in the US. And actually, a lot of people now just do not pick up the phone, because largely what you get in terms of phone calls are scammers and so on. So if somebody's going to phone you up and say, hey, can I ask you a load of personal questions? Then you're going to put the phone down. So there is some evidence that polling is actually being hugely tilted towards elderly white people who are the ones who are confident to pick the phone up. And of course, then they say, well, we have this digital modelling that will, that is data that will correct for these, inconsistencies. Well, how good is your model, would be my question. How accurate is that? What's that based on? Because if you're simply not being able to talk to enough people, then this polling is actually not very helpful.
There is a general bigger problem with polling here, isn't there? And so far as you say, people don't pick up the phone anymore unless you are my mum.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's 87 and is by the phone. But you have that idea that what effect does attrition have on anybody's ability to work out what's going on? At what point do we actually say, we don't trust the polls because nobody could be bothered to fill in the form, spend that extra 5 minutes, etc., etc.? David?
I think you're right. Polling began as part of public relations in the 1930s. There were fragments of it before. And the people who were involved with it tried to pretend that they were very, very scientific. They used all sorts of words from science. And they used words from photography also, snapshots and things like that. To say that there's a snapshot suggests that there's an ongoing persistent event or a discernible pattern, which you can take a fraction of. Suppose people, and maybe there was something like that when everybody would answer the phone and people would tend to vote in political parties in the same way for a long period of time. Or perhaps when people were less fickle. When there's less social media about a certain event, I might just not think about it and have a preference brand. Think of the advertising of deodorants aimed at early teenagers. That's when people often decide what toothpaste and deodorant they get, and then they don't think about it again. So polling in that area is probably pretty accurate. In these things now, I agree with you, it could be impossible now with the telephoning, and it's really hard. I suppose the people who probably are most accurate at it are people like Elon Musk or Dominic Cummings with Cambridge Analytica, where you get large-scale readouts, and because you have a quite big database there of millions or hundreds of millions, then you can extrapolate better. But the ideal of a static, sensible people, and you can calmly ask them what their fixed views are, that that attitude, that underlying attitude, might no longer exist.
Which kind of undermines the last 2 years of news coverage of everything to do with the presidential election. And the question asks, we've got less than a month now until the elections. Alex, you follow it really, really closely. When should normal people start to pay? You're normal. When should mortals really start to pay attention to this thing?
Well, I think, there should be big questions around polling generally. We've also seen it be very wrong in a lot of elections recently. I mean, France, an obvious example, but also, we've seen it be wrong in the UK. We've seen it be wrong in the US. I mean, it's frequently been wrong in the last few years. And I think people want it to be this super wise future predictor. And of course, any kind of future predictor is extremely fallible, because you just can't. If it was that simple, we would all be doing it, basically. So I think what mere mortals and normal people should do is vote according to their preference in a very simple way, and actually not pay too much attention to any of this noise. It will be very interesting to see. I mean, because in terms of the polling, it's currently putting the US election very, very close, and particularly in the swing states, which are the significant fields to look at, really. It will be very interesting to see how accurate that is. And I think also quite difficult because, of course, some people are voting already in the US presidential election. Certainly friends of mine who are Americans overseas are already casting their votes. Some people will cast early votes. And as we get to polling day, things might change again. There is very often an October surprise that may be coming.
Was the hurricane the October surprise?
Well, it could have been. But we don't know yet. October isn't over. More could happen. I mean, I think it's extremely hard to predict, and things could shift quite a lot, actually, in the next few weeks.
You're right. And also with our famous echo chambers and bubbles, it's hard to get that same surprise because many people are not seeing the same news. They're not even spinning off the same news. It's just unaware. I spoke to somebody a while ago who said that there are only forest fires in North America in left-leaning woke states. I said Montana is a lovely place, but it's not a left-leaning woke space, nor is Saskatchewan. And he was unaware that there had been forest fires in places other than Northern California.
Wow.
So if you're unaware, you know why I'm stammering? I'm stammering because I grew up for many years thinking that rational analysis and calm discussion would have some effect if everybody just settled down and took it easy. But when there's moods of great resentment, nobody's taking it easy. You're very eager. You will have surges of opinion from one side to another, and you'll have desperate feelings of belief in angry things. We know that in modern societies, there's been a move from nation states to consumer states. Nation states, you kind of trust the people on top, and you're a nation, united with all these people. Consumers, your particular desire. I'm happy in this relationship, so I stay married. I'm unhappy, I get unmarried. I like this article I'm reading, I click on it. I don't like this article, I click away from it. People who are involved with dating websites say they wish to go back several centuries and go back to arranged marriages because it's awful. So when there's fickleness, we have a lot of that in society now. And when it's combined with pressure, you have fickleness plus pressure. This makes grown men stammer.
You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, David Bodanis and Alex von Tunzelmann. The time in Hong Kong is, 16:33 p.m, 11:33 a.m. in Mombasa. And let's head to Nairobi to have a look at the latest news. Naveena Kottoor, Monocle's correspondent in the region, is there. Very good morning to you, Naveena. You know what question I'm just about to ask you, don't you? How's it looking
morning,
where
Emma.
you are? Good morning, Naveena.
It is beautiful. It's a very beautiful Sunday midday here. I'm planning a barbecue later in the day, I'm afraid. And we're entering the warm season. So as the weather in the UK becomes more miserable, I think we will have more sunshine.
Absolutely. How do we get a flight tonight? Can someone quickly get us flights to Nairobi so we can go to Naveena's barbecue later on? Because I can think of nothing nicer. Actually, what are you cooking?
There'll be prawns on the barbecue with homemade mayonnaise. Is that really ridiculous?
That's not ridiculous at all. That sounds that sounds otherworldly given the thickness of the coats that are being worn in London. Right, everybody to Naveena's for her prawns later on. Thank you very much for taking time away from your chopping and your marinating to have a look at the papers for us and tell us what's happening where you are. You want to start with South Africa, is that right?
Yes, we just heard about elections. So one of the election promises of the new South African coalition partner, the Democratic Alliance, was to liberalize the economy and also the visa system. So the new Minister of Home Affairs, Leon Schreiber, announced quite important changes to the visa system this week. He has announced that it will be possible for remote workers who are not working directly in South Africa to obtain a visa if you earn at least $37,000 a year, you're likely to get a visa to live and work in South Africa. He's also announced a new points-based system for work visas in order to simplify work permits in South Africa. I think we will have to see how this is received, because there was a lot of backlash against the idea that foreigners should come and work, and it should be easier for foreigners to work in South Africa. But it's a big piece of reform that has just been announced.
It's a huge piece, isn't it? Because it's we have the remote work visa as part of a new points-based system for work visas. And it seems like a very conscious and genuine push by the South African economy, who are claiming that but things could be boosted by 1.2%. I'm not entirely sure what they're measuring there and how they're measuring it.
Yes, I mean, his argument is that people who will come with at least $30,000 a year will spend money, will pay rent, will pay VAT, and that will boost the economy. He's also arguing that this will make it more attractive for tourists to maybe come, or for people to come and work and then spend some time time and money in the tourism industry. But I think it's important to stress that the majority of foreign workers in South Africa are from the neighboring countries, from Zimbabwe, primarily half of them. And he had played with the idea of granting basically a permit for people like that from Zimbabwe, but that was met with a lot of backlash, because most parties were campaigning on a sort of very strict no visa for foreign workers ticket. So I think we will have to see how this goes down, and also how easy it is to implement these kind of reforms, because from what I hear, it takes a very long time to get your work permit and your visa granted in South Africa.
Let's move on to an astonishing story about what's happening to the president of Cameroon. The media are not allowed to talk about what's happened to President Paul Biya because there are rumours that he has died.
Yes, lucky me that I'm not reporting from Cameroon, but from Nairobi. But this week, especially on Tuesday, there were a lot of rumors flying around saying that he had died. One of the reasons is that he has not been seen in public since September 8th, when he was seen on TV leaving Beijing after the Africa-China summit that he was able to attend. I think it's important to stress that we have no confirmation about his health or where he might be, but especially on social media, there were a lot of reports that he had died. So the authorities have said that they are setting up monitoring cells to track this kind of online debate, and have dismissed all the rumors as pure fantasy. Biya is 91 years old, and he has been president for 41 years. So it is, we have seen examples of presidents from Nigeria and other places who have died in exile or who have died while undergoing medical care abroad. But so far, we don't know anything about him.
Goodness me. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Let's talk a little bit about Lewis Hamilton saying that Formula One can't ignore Africa.
Yes, Lewis Hamilton has spent some time over the summer talking to officials in Rwanda and in South Africa, and he's set on bringing Formula One to South Africa, to Africa. He's very keen on Rwanda, I have to say. He says it would be a fantastic place to have the race. Rwanda does not have a circuit; it would have to be built, and I think this is currently being discussed. The last time Formula One happened here in Africa was actually in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in 1993. And he says it's really time for it to come back. In the case of Rwanda, they're very keen. They're hosting a big conference in December. The Formula One's governing body will be holding its general assembly in Kigali. I think Rwanda is really keen to secure a race, but there's obviously a lot of criticism, especially directed at Rwanda, given the fact that the race course would have to be built. And there are always accusations about sports washing. Rwanda is, well known for sponsoring Arsenal, Paris Saint-Germain, Bayern Munich. And a lot of people are asking why a country that is so densely populated has chosen to host, a sport that will require quite a lot of space to build this race course.
Naveena Kottoor, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Nairobi, and the best of luck with your barbecue. We are checking flights. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, joining me around the table, Alex von Tunzelmann and David Bodanis. Alex, you wanted to bring in a story this morning about DNA testing and Christopher Columbus.
Yes. Well, there's this new documentary which is claiming that they've DNA tested the mortal remains, so they say, of Christopher Columbus, although our first point of caution is that nobody's 100% sure that the body in the vault is actually Christopher Columbus, but the generally accepted one, which I think is in Seville. They've DNA tested it, and their big headline story is not an Italian, or not exclusively an Italian, but actually has Spanish and Jewish ancestry. That's their big story. Now, as a historian, I have a couple of points about this. First of all, even if we accept that this was probably Columbus's body, so that's the first hitch.
I mean, what's the likelihood? So not all of us know.
Pretty likely, but there are competing possible bodies.
I do love it. How many bodies are we talking about?
I'm not absolutely sure without checking, but I mean, it's not 100% certain is the point. But, let's say we go with it.
All right,
These are the generally accepted ones.
Trust them.
I think there are some big questions around this kind of DNA testing in terms of what does it really mean. Now, it might be kind of interesting, even if it's true, but how you, at that stage, you're going back a very long way. What would it mean? Christopher Columbus was not meaningfully Jewish. I mean, he was a person who grew up very much being a Christian and living in a Christian society. It might have been news to him that he had Jewish ancestry. So, it's sort of, there's an oddness about claiming this heritage for him when that was not remotely his lived experience.
Do we know how Jewish he was in terms of when the DNA contains, is it sort of just very closely like his mother was Jewish, or are we looking several generations back?
Well, I think this is the other problem, that you end up with this sort of homeopathic puzzle
right.
about exactly what this DNA shows. And of course, there are very broad assumptions around this. Now you have, of course, these often sort of vanity DNA testing kits today that will tell you, you're 4% Ukrainian and 2% Senegalese. What this is really based on is modern nation-state boundaries that do not necessarily remotely map onto people's historical experience, and might mean something very, very different to your ancestors than they might mean today. They're based basically on how much DNA you share with people who live in those places today. So those are not necessarily some sort of, it becomes almost a sort of horoscope, really, rather than something that's necessarily completely reliable. It can produce results that you can verify, especially if you do have context about who your ancestors were. And, it certainly, I'm sure, can be interesting. But I think it's historically difficult to say anything too concrete about those results.
And how does that possibly change our perception of Christopher Columbus to find out that he was a Spanish Jew?
Well, I don't think it does.
This is the thing, isn't it? It doesn't change in any way manifestly. Or will this now spark 1 million books of people saying, we knew he was Spanish all along because ...
Alex got to a good point. One of the frustrating things about knowing too much about a field is that it's hard to have strong opinions. When you know very little, I find, for me, ignorance never gets in the way of really emphatic conversation on over dinner. But Alex made the point, how can one tell? The way to tell what a national group somebody is in is comparing with many other people from that time. I believe there's been very little study of 15th century Spanish and Italian graveyards, which can be dated and accurate. In fact, I'm guessing close to zero. So the result probably is just entirely made up. There's no database of what types of Spanish people were like in the 15th century and the variation. So it's kind of like a fantasy story. It shows the sort of thing we would like to know. We can either praise him or blame him if we think the discovery of the Americas was a good thing, but it's based on very, very little. But it's catchy. It's a very catchy result.
And it does mean that if you're an Italian or Spanish startup wondering what to go into, then having a poke around a few graveyards might be rather profitable.
Yes. I mean, well, I suppose you could be. Well, could it be profitable, or would it cost far more than any actual interest in this would financially justify? But there has been a boom in these things, and there's a good deal of discussion about this at the moment because, of course, the company 23andMe, which is one of these very popular DNA testing companies, is financially struggling, and there's some talk that it could be sold or whatever. And I think then you start to get into rather serious ethical concerns in that having given your DNA to this company, and of course for various reasons. Now, some people have very legitimate reasons they would like their DNA tested. For instance, if you're adopted and you don't have an idea of your family history, that may help you culturally to find a place. It may also actually give you some advising about your genetic risks, information you wouldn't otherwise have.
Totally.
So absolutely there are legitimate reasons to do this, as well as the vanity of, I'm 4% Ukrainian or whatever else. But a lot of people have been doing it purely for the interest. Now, what that company now has is a very large genetic database on you that include your health risks. And although in their terms and conditions give them the right to vary how they use that information as much as they like. So if this is sold, say, to private healthcare insurers or somebody like that, if that data goes to them, we could well find that in the future those private healthcare insurers are going to say, well, we're not going to insure you because we think you've got a very high risk of this. So, in fact, you're now uninsurable.
Totally. And it goes even wider with a ripple effect. Large companies often try to find data on relatives of people. So if you have relatives with schizophrenia, to use that diagnostic term, there's a greater likelihood that you would. So certain promotions might be zapped without your even being aware of it. I think there's a deeper thing, a related deep thing about finding one's 3% this or 12% that. It's this notion from before 1945 that there's this eugenic thing that breeds true, and you can't escape from it. So it used post-World War II, a lot of people wanted to think that we're individuals. We can be trained certain ways, and we have certain habits, but limitations from the body. But we're trained certain ways, and we can adjust and adapt. There was no feeling that Japanese are automatic like this, or Austrians are automatic like that. It has to do with history and culture and events. More recently, there's been the feeling about mental health versus mental illness, which is in some extent a really good distinction. I think in Britain the shift was about 10 years ago, where instead of athletes being embarrassed that they couldn't focus, they would say, look, if I have a sore shoulder, I want it to be fixed. If I have a mental issue, it would be foolish not to be fixed. But the notion there is that there's something automatic about you which you cannot consciously override. So if somebody says, oh, I'm 10% of a certain country, well, you could say, well, if I'm 10% Japanese and I think of 1944, I think tough warriors. If I think of 1946, I think, humble people rebuilding a country. So which target is it? So a weakness with much of this genetic testing is the notion of wrapping yourself up passively in fantasies of the past and leaving aside our agency.
Would you agree with that, Alex?
Very much,
We're
yes.
into this idea that, you suddenly find out that you're 10% Austrian, so but suddenly a pair of lederhosen appears in your wardrobe.
I mean, fun. But, who doesn't love lederhosen? But I absolutely agree. And I think you can become obsessed with that. And as I say, these are not in any case based on the past, but on a sort of likely survey of what genetic ancestry you share today. So actually, you're only equivalent to modern Austrians. As David correctly says, they have not disinterred the Habsburgs to do this testing. This is based on a very modern conception of what nation states even are, let alone how they identify.
How much does this change the analysis of history?
Not at all. Because the thing is, with those people, it makes no difference, and that's why it wouldn't with Columbus. Columbus still lived the same life he lived, regardless of what we might genetically know about him. That doesn't actually alter his experience one jot. It makes no difference to how he existed in history.
Unless, for example, he might have, if he factor in perhaps that he might have been aware of his history. He might know. That might change things.
But we will not know that because
we can't ask him, obviously.
I suppose it can suggest to historians interesting psychological questions. Like if we find out that a certain member of the British royal family was illegitimate, who nobody knew was illegitimate, but we think, oh, were they aware? Were they aware? And then one can dive into the archives. But I think this overall notion of when will we feel that we're free and when will we feel that we're not? Again, one of the advantages of Trump for his supporters, by the way, there are not many sentences that I begin saying one of the advantages of Trump. But really for supporters is the notion I can be totally free. I'm not in any category whatsoever. How wonderful that must be to imagine.
Let's move on to another story. David, you want to talk to us about, we're talking about DNA testing and sort of like widespread harvesting of information and what we do. That's a nice little neat jump to AI.
Yes.
Which seems to have actually harvested the Nobel Prize for itself.
Twice. 2 Nobel Prizes this year with AI. One in physics, the other for the fellow in Britain with the terrific company which can do things like understand how proteins fold together in complex ways in the body. The second one, it shows that AI can be a terrific tool. To be honest, computers before could be a terrific tool. Think of computer-aided design and architecture. You can, in that sense, as a tool helping us, I'm fine. The first one, Mr. Hinton, I'm more excited about. He's a British guy who did most of his work in the U.S. because there were often better financial opportunities there. And he left, was it Google that he left?
Yes, I think
so. Yeah,
so.
And he left Google because he thought he was being censored there and couldn't tell the truth about the dangers of this thing. Do you know there's some things around us which are dangerous, like smoke, where we grew up around fires and smoke. If there's a smoky room, we're aware of it. We didn't grow up around, say, gamma radiation. And if there's terrible radiation in a room, we can't tell. Famously, the dodo bird was unaware that these sweaty men coming towards them with large stick clubs were dangerous things. They weren't involved with it. So Geoffrey Hinton, who got the Nobel Prize in Physics just a few weeks ago, uses that example for how we are with AI. We have no awareness of the potential danger of this, of having things around us which are more powerful. There's a politics guy at Cambridge who said, yes, we do have examples of those. We just don't realize. He said large nations and also corporations are these unthinking galumphy monsters that float around that no individual can control. And in some respects, I don't know if they're smarter than us, but they're certainly more powerful than us. And we're sort of in their hands. AI might be more of that.
AI has obviously, as we mentioned a moment ago, taken the physics and chemistry prize this year as well. It has appropriated it for itself because the wonderful thing about Geoffrey Hinton is he failed at physics. And, you know, so you get this wonderful idea of how, well, does the Nobel Prize now reflect the way that the world is going? Has it had to pivot a little bit away from its traditional
Yes. Yeah. So
role?
There's a little bit of a historical snapshot. You can't get the Nobel Prize posthumously. So they often have to. There's a long delay. So Hinton's work was decades ago. The guy from London, that was more recent work. But the Nobel Prize, also the categories have shifted. There was never one for molecular biology or DNA research because when Alfred Nobel set it up, there was no such thing. So they get it within the medicine prize. But it's kind of a readout. The Swedish academies are always nervous. They've made some real bozo choices in the past. So they really want to get it right. They want to be polite and decent and also keep the world respect for there. So they try to stay up to date.
And there's a lovely idea that's in The Guardian this weekend about the impact that the prize actually has on people. Apparently, Seamus Heaney, when he was awarded the Literature Prize in 1995, described the experience as being hit by a mostly benign avalanche. The fact is that the awarding of prizes in an individual or a state's history, how does that actually, does it genuinely elevate them?
Well,
does it change their story?
It very much depends on the prize. I mean, I think the Nobel has a level of kind of global impact that is far higher than most of these most of these gongs handed out by governments and so on, partly because it is independently awarded. I mean, when you get governments handing them out, there tends to be an element of nationalism about that, mm-hmm. and therefore inherently internationally a kind of parochialism about that. Whereas I think when you're talking about, there's obviously an attempt with the Nobel Prize to do something very international. As David says, for better or for worse, there have been some extraordinary issues in the past, certainly particularly around the political ones, the Peace Prize being the obvious one, which has been awarded to people like Henry Kissinger very controversially and so forth. You basically get it for starting a war and then stopping a lot of the time, which historically does not always look like a great achievement, but may at the time. So, I mean, I think there's a sort of the Nobel, I think, genuinely does make a very big difference. We've just seen the Nobel Prize winner elevated to the leadership of Bangladesh, for instance, after the ejecting of Sheikh Hasina. That has enormously increased his prominence. And I do think that, that it's one that certainly does have an impact. And I think internationally, for instance, I certainly know the Literature Prize internationally makes a very large difference to your book sales. Although I believe within the UK, the Booker still has more impact on your sales than the Nobel.
The end of the Seamus Heaney quote is that from that point on, when he'd won the Nobel Prize for Literature, his life was no longer his own. He said, I just have to follow a calendar of events and just turn up.
The output often goes down after that.
Sounds quite boring because they just have to go to places and be a Nobel Prize winner. Let's move to a story that you mentioned at the top of the story, Alex, which is about no babies but dogs.
No babies but dogs. Well, this is a story from South Korea. It's in the New York Times today. And I just, we sort of heard This is a story we've touched on a bit and that we've certainly talked about a bit at Monocle, but I did find this particular write-up is extremely captivating. So, I mean, we probably we've all observed this story that birth rates are falling in a lot of parts of the world. South Korea is very high, that people really are sort of, particularly among women, they're not wanting to get married and have children. They're wanting to live quite a different life. And I mean, what's very interesting is that what seems to be taking the place of that, of course, we still need some sort of emotional connection, is an absolute boom in pets. Now, Korea has been sort of in the past rather notorious for breeding dogs for food. That has actually been banned. That's been banned since January. And what seems to be happening instead is that it's absolutely exploding the pet population. The dogs have clearly very much
We're not
shifted.
eating them, we're now pampering them.
Illegal now. We're now pampering them. And pampering them to a sort of absolutely extraordinary level. I mean, this piece is wonderful and sort of goes into lots of different aspects of this, that the boom in pet services has really changed things. So online shopping malls say they sell more baby carriages for dogs than for babies now.
Wow.
That you must bring them around in this. They have various people. There's a lady who is interviewed who says she wears an old $38 padded jacket but has bought $150 jackets for her Jindo dog. There are a lot of people that... here who are really fussing about it. I think my favourite quote, if I can find it, yes. The journalist speaks to a couple at a temple that is for dogs. So you bring your dogs to this temple for a sort of religious experience. And she talks to this couple who have 2 Snow White Pomeranians with them. And the wife says, "I feel more attached to my dogs than my husband," said Kang Hyun-ji, 31, who got married last October and was there with her spouse. Her husband, Kim Sang-bak, 32, shrugged with an embarrassed smile. So he's just sitting there being told he's done. Well, not even second, but third.
He's not even getting the trolley. This is embarrassing.
No trolley for him.
Finally, we have a minute and a half to talk about cruises. There's a brilliant article in The Guardian this week about the rise of the never-ending cruise. David, your take on it all is in the light of, I think it's the Odyssey, which has been stuck in Belfast. People have paid their life savings or not to go on a 3-year cruise. Are you not on this boat? It seems like a typical David Bodanis thing to do.
When I was a little boy, I used to dream of going to jail. I thought that would be so nice. I could sit in a little room. I would get food. My sisters wouldn't be there. I could just read. The reality would be different. Cruises are kind of like that on a bigger level. A lot of times people like fancy tailors because there's a nice, polite man who kneels at your feet and does what you want. Retail therapy is a pleasure because there's a little formalized, dramatic interaction with the person, and you can make a little joke. They have to laugh because they need your money. On a cruise, the world is sort of the fantasy of a sort of think of that sort of thuggish, unpleasant person who sits with their legs akimbo and tells you things, young girlie, because they're the older executive. You can be like that. There's on a big ship, I don't know, there might be 1,000 people.
Massive kindergarten.
Yes, there might be 1,000 people around you serving, and they have to be nice to you. So you're automatically treated in a certain way.
Big drunk kindergarten.
Yes, yes.
We've got 10 seconds, so Alex, tell us, you a lot of your colleagues and friends do cruises, but from a professional point of view.
Yes, historians are often employed to give talks on them, or perhaps tour guide around a certain part of the world. I mean, certainly it's something. It seems to me that it needs to be much better paid to be appealing.
Because it's not much fun.
I think it's probably... Well, I think it can be fun, but I think it's probably, yes, quite taxing dealing with exactly the sort of people that David has just described.
Because how often do your friends do cruises?
Most of them have only done it once.
OK. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, Alex von Tunzelmann, David Bodanis, Naveena Kottoor and Tyler Brûlé. Thanks too to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday returns at the same time next week. But for now, until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.